Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. As you may or may not know, recently it was my birthday, and in today's video we are going to talk about one of the gifts that I received from my family. It's actually the thing that I was most excited about receiving, pretty much the only thing that I had suggested I wanted, and that is Masters of the Universe Battleground from Archon Studio. I love Masters of the Universe. I grew up watching the cartoons, I had all of the toys. And recently, when Archon Studio ran a Kickstarter for a Masters of the Universe board game, it was something I paid a lot of attention to. However, ultimately, I realised that I wasn't that excited about the board game they were offering. What I really wanted was a tabletop miniatures game. And then, pretty much out of nowhere, this happened. Archon Studio announced Masters of the Universe Battleground, which is indeed a tabletop miniatures combat game, exactly what I was hoping for. Unfortunately, this game is under the same distribution restrictions as Archon Studios' Masters of the Universe Fields of Eternia board game, which was the game that they were funding on Kickstarter. That means this isn't available in the United States, but you can pick it up throughout Europe. Regardless, I'm excited to dive into this box, and that's exactly what we're going to do in today's video. I'm going to look through all the components, I'm going to share my initial thoughts on the rules, and everything you get for your money. First of all, let's check out what is sure to be a big draw for this particular game, and that is the miniatures. You get 10 miniatures in this game because this is a skirmish level game, it's not a big army game as you might expect. And you get 5 heroic characters and 5 villains. This is the sprue for the heroes, and as you can see we have hard plastic miniatures here. They will require clipping and gluing, and our characters are He-Man. Where's He-Man? Well, there's the back of his head anyway. You get He-Man, you get Orko, you get Man-at-Arms, you get Ram-Man and Stratos. And that's not a bad mix of heroes. I do think it is probably criminal that Teela is not included in this, but I'm absolutely sure there will be loads of expansions for this. This sort of game really is a license to print money. I know for a fact that I would purchase every single character they release. But yeah, I would have liked to have seen Teela in the starting lineup. But Orko's there, so I'm fine. The miniatures themselves do look a little bit small. I think we're looking at 28mm scale here. They are on 25mm bases. The bases do have nice molded detailing on them, and also if you look at them carefully you will see there is actually a front arc on them. That is because facing is important for this game. I would say it looks like these are in quite a lot of parts, perhaps more parts than I expected, more parts than they really needed. And there are some very small components that will need to be clipped off very carefully. I'm not really looking forward to putting these together. They don't look like they will be a huge amount of fun to deal with, but the details themselves are really nice. Check him out, there's the MVP right there. And here we have our second sprue, the villains in glorious purple. Of course you get Skeletor, you get Evil Lyn, there is also Triclops, Trapjaw, and one of my personal favourites, Merman. Again, there is a major character here that I think should have been included and is missing, that is Beastman. In fact, while I really like the lineup on both sides here, while I think it is a good mix of characters, and while I think 5 miniatures on each side is probably enough to get started with in the game, I think it would have been nice to have an additional character on each frame. If we could have got Teela for the heroes and Beastman for the villains, I don't think I would have had anything to complain about. But again, we have nice detailing on the moulded bases, and quite a few fiddly little parts that will need to be trimmed out and glued together. And I will assemble a few of those to show you at the end of the video. For now we're going to move on to look at the frames of terrain. You get 6 frames of terrain in total, that's 2 each of 3 different designs. On this first one we have a ladder for going up and down different areas of elevation, we have platforms, and then we have some walls and a low barrier. And those are really nicely detailed. They look like they will paint up very quickly and easily with some simple dry brushing techniques. And you will notice that they are on hexes, and that is because this game plays out on a hex board. Here is our second frame. We have some walls, and then we have some low terrain for scrambling over, some pillars, rocks, a little bit of statue debris, that sort of thing. Nicely detailed on both sides. Some of this terrain seems to have elements that are directly inspired by the old Castle Grayskull playset, and that's nice to see, a little bit of nostalgia for the fans. And here is our final frame, more walls and some more broken ruins and some rocks. And these are really quite chunky, they've got quite a bit of weight to them. They should be quite sturdy on the tabletop, and that's always important. And of course you get 2 of each of these frames, so that's quite a lot of terrain to build your battlefields. That's it in terms of the plastic, and of course you do get a miniatures assembly guide, because you are going to have to get out the old side cutters. These look pretty straightforward in terms of instructions to follow. I don't think there's going to be any problems there. Very nicely laid out. And not a lot to say there. One thing to note, Orko comes with a clear stand because he is flying. That stand, because it is clear, is not on the frame itself. I found my stand tucked in the dice bag with the dice, so if you buy this game, watch out for that. Don't just open the bag of dice and then chuck the bag away. You may chuck away your little plastic stand too. Next up we have the rulebook. This is very nicely produced, 32 pages in total and full colour throughout. Lots of diagrams, seemed pretty nicely laid out. I have read through the whole thing. The rules themselves seem pretty straightforward. They don't seem like they're pushing out the boat in any particular aspect. They don't look like there's anything that's going to set the world alight. It's all quite rudimentary. I think a lot of the interesting stuff is going to come from the characters themselves, the items they have, and their interactions rather than the rules themselves. But I will do another video where I go through the rules in more detail and talk about them. There is an interesting kind of activation system based on cards. Some of the wording is a little bit clunky. There are some powers on some of the cards that I will show you in a moment that I'm not 100% sure on. I have had to go back to certain sections of the rules and read them over and over again just to make sure I fully understand what they're talking about. In addition to the rules, you get this beautifully illustrated Battleground book. Again, this is in full colour. It's only 12 pages. It has the cost table on the back. This has the cost for all of the characters and items that come in the core set. I don't know why they didn't put those costs on the cards themselves. I guess that's so that they can tweak the values later on if they need to for things like tournament play, but I would rather have seen the details on the cards themselves, but whatever, they're on the back of this book. Inside this book we have the instructions for setting up the game. Interestingly, there is a section on building decks because there is a deck building element to this game, which is not something I was expecting. And then we have some different battle plans. We have the ancient ruins, we have the secret hideout, the sands of time, the stone city, and then we have the desert gate. I think the one thing here that is a little bit disappointing for me is that this is not very narrative based. There's not really stories behind these scenarios. They're just different layouts for the battleground. And there is only one hex map in the box, so you're always fighting over those same ruined spaces. But I really think that when it comes to something like Masters of the Universe, the interesting stuff is going to come from narrative scenarios. You want those adventures where Prince Adam has been captured and his friends have to go and rescue him, make sure he gets the Sword of Power so he can transform into He-Man right at the very end and save the day. Or one of Orko's spells goes horribly wrong and you get teleported into a dangerous area. Maybe that's going to come, or maybe that's going to be something the community has to deal with itself. I know for a fact that I am going to be making narrative scenarios when I play this game, because I don't just want to have my heroes and my villains slugging it out over a battlefield. I want something to drive those conflicts. I want to recreate the cartoons on my tabletop, and I think a lot of other people are going to want to do that as well. I would expect to see lots of scenarios from fans appearing online. We will see what happens there. For now, this is a good start. It's a lot of different layouts. It's got everything you need to learn the game, have some fights, and explore the different characters, but there needs to be somewhere for it to go, I think. One final thing I wanted to mention while I am talking about the paperwork included in the box, there was this flyer for a limited model which is only available at tournaments as a prize, and this is something I'm not really happy to see. I am never really impressed with limited edition stuff that you have to go to particular events to get. I just think this is the sort of stuff that should be available to everybody. There are going to be fans everywhere that want this stuff, and they're going to miss out on it, and that's a bit disappointing. So I'm not too keen on that aspect of it. I hope it is always going to be alternative poses of characters. I would like to make sure that I can get my own battle cat, that I don't have to go to a tournament that I'm never going to go to in order to get one. Next up we have the board. As I mentioned before, this is hex base. The hexes are 25mm across, and yeah, it's a nicely detailed board, but it is only one-sided. You can see it is black on the reverse. So this is the only battlefield you are getting in the core box. I would imagine they will release others at some point, but this is a good one to start with. It matches obviously the terrain you get in the box. You will see there are darker shaded areas at the top and the bottom. Those mark out your deployment areas. It's a relatively compact board, so this game isn't going to take up a huge amount of table space. You don't need a 6x4. This isn't like a big game of Warhammer Fantasy Battle or something. This is a nice, tidy, compact skirmish game. The board quality itself is okay. It's a little bit on the thin side, and as it is only a single-sided board, I would have liked to have seen it mounted really, but it's okay. You then get 2 punch boards of tokens, and these are very, very cleanly punched because even as I took them out of the box, they were just falling out of the card. So very cleanly punched. They have decent iconography on them. This is like a curse, this is a stun, this is a cripple, this is a blind. These are objective tokens, those are wound tokens. There is an Overwatch system in this game where you can interrupt your opponents, so the crossed spears are for Overwatch. We have mana, which is like your energy for casting spells. And then over here we have focus tokens, which will give you boosts during the game. There's a little merman and a little Triclops token there as well. One thing to point out, on many of the cards I noticed a little symbol of a skull and crossbones, and for a very long time I had no idea what that symbol meant. It wasn't referenced in the rules book, and I couldn't find a token that had that symbol on it, until I flipped this over, and you will see all of the green debuff tokens have a skull and crossbones on the back. So if you ever see a rule that says you gain a bonus if an opponent has a skull and crossbones symbol, it just means if they have a debuff of any kind. And here is the second board. It's pretty much the same, except for instead of the debuffs, we have the buffs. So we've got like regenerate, this is a movement boost, this is a defense boost, this is an attack boost. Over here, this is interesting, we have replacement tokens. These are used to replace your miniature if your miniature is positioned in such a way that it might fall over or it's in an awkward position where it doesn't quite fit. You can just put this token in its place, which is a nice little feature, I think. And of course, we also have a longer range ruler because weird thing about this game, even though it is played out over a hex-based grid, the hex-based grid is pretty much only used for movement. If you're doing ranged attacks, you have to measure using the rulers in a straight line. Next up we have our bag of 6-sided dice. You get 10 in total, and note Orko's little flight stand in there as well. Yes, this game uses regular D6. It's quite nice to see a game that doesn't have custom dice for a change. I do like a good old-fashioned D6 sometimes. There are some interesting elements to the dice system in this game. For example, there is an exploding dice system. There is a reroll system where you can spend mana to do rerolls. But yes, if you get successes on a 6, then that dice will explode, which means you can roll an extra dice. But they have a nerf built into the exploding dice, so although exploding dice can explode again, they only succeed on a higher value than the original dice did. So gradually they become less effective as they explode. But yeah, nice to see a good old-fashioned D6 exploding dice. And then we have our character cards for each of the 10 characters included in the core set. This is He-Man's, of course. On the reverse, you get a really nice picture of the character. You get their name. Here, we have some interesting stuff. We have a basic item. Every character starts with a specific item. In this case, it is the Sword of Power. But then under here, we have slots. We have melee weapons, ranged weapons, armor, shields, and trinkets. And the icons here indicate which additional items you can equip your character with if you so wish to. So in this case, He-Man can take an extra melee weapon, an extra ranged weapon, he can wear 1 piece of armor, he can bring 1 shield with him, and he can have 2 trinkets as well. And there are ways to get additional slots with additional things that you can take, but each character will have a different distribution of items. And that's a neat little feature. And then on the reverse, you get a portrait of your character, and then you get some stats. The stats are, starting from top left, wounds, toughness, mind, power, perception, strength, and then movement. There are 2 movement values because there is a focus system in this game where you can spend an action to gain a focus token, and then you can either spend that token to move a greater distance. In the example of He-Man here, if you spent your token, you would move up to 8 hexes instead of 5, but you can also use those focus tokens to give you an advantage when you make a test of some kind. And the value for things like toughness and mind and strength, that is the number of dice you roll when you make a test using those values. For example, if you wanted to make a combat attack using a melee weapon, you would look at your strength stat, which is 5 in the case of He-Man, and you would roll 5d6. You would be looking for, under normal circumstances, a 4+, and each 4+ is 1 success. Your opponent would then roll d6 based on their toughness value, so in the case of He-Man here that would be 3, and then each 4+ there would deduct 1 success. You then look at your total number of successes and you refer to the weapon you have used to make the attack, because it isn't a 1-to-1 ratio between successes and the damage you inflict. For example, you may have a weapon that says if you have 1 success you cause 1 wound, if you have 3 successes or more you cause 2. But we'll look at some weapons in a moment. You will also notice on the card we have 2 special powers. Of course we have I Have the Power, which says during any test, He-Man may re-roll 1 extra dice for each mana token he spends on re-rolls. He-Man also has the ability Superhuman Reflexes, which seems like a bit of a nerf really, something to keep him at a more even level compared to the other characters, because he can't gain mana tokens from Fate and Glory cards. We'll talk about those in a moment. He only gets mana when he gains a focus token. But anyway, each character has 2 abilities like this. And they're all different. He-Man's are both passive abilities, they're always in effect. There are other abilities where you have to actually spend a cost. It might be an action point, it might be a mana point, it might be both. But there's some pretty interesting stuff on those cards, and as I mentioned before, the interesting element of this game is going to be from picking different teams, seeing how they interact with each other, seeing what combos you can pull off. All that good tabletop skirmish game stuff. Here are the 5 cards for the heroes. We've already looked at He-Man in detail. Ram Man basically has abilities that relate to ramming people. He can make extra charge attacks, and then he can gain a focus token if he finishes a movement engaged with an enemy. Orko gets lots of magic at the start of the game, but he actually has a nerf as well that whenever he casts a spell there's a chance it doesn't work. Stratos is a good leader, so he can actually give focus tokens to other characters, so already you can see there's a little combo there. He can give focus tokens to He-Man. Stratos of course can also fly. And then you have Man-at-Arms, who is just a badass as you would expect. He is a master tactician. He automatically gains an Overwatch token if he finishes his activation at least 8 inches away from all the enemies. And he has an ability that grants mana tokens to other characters, so again, another way to power up He-Man, representing that way they always work together, they always fight side by side. He-Man is always relying on Man-at-Arms and his tactical prowess. It's nice to see those little character beats baked into the cards. And then we have our team of nefarious villains. I will show you all of the characters in a moment, but I just wanted to point out Triclops. This is one of those cards where the wording on a card is a little bit odd to me. It says here on his Optic Blast ability, if an enemy within 8 inches receives a debuff, Triclops can spend 1 to 3 mana tokens to test his power, and then basically if he gets a success he will wound that character. But it's that part that says if an enemy receives the debuff. That sort of suggests this is an interrupt ability, but I'm not sure that's how it's intended to be. I'm not really sure how that is supposed to play out when you would actually be able to make that Optic Blast ability. But that is something that is a bit of an issue with some of these cards. Some of the wording isn't quite as clear as it could be. In fact, the Gamma Vision ability is also quite weirdly worded. You test your power +2 against the mind of an enemy target within 12 inches, and if you succeed, then you get to place your Triclops token next to them. And it says that all attacks against a character with the Triclops token gain a focus token. And I assumed that just meant that when you attacked that character, you attacked with the bonuses if you had a focus token. But is that what it means? Or does it mean that after you've attacked, you gain a focus token? And if you're a character that gets bonuses when you gain a focus token, like He-Man, does that mean you would get your bonus from that skill? Because it's the attack itself that's getting the focus token, not the character. It's just not quite as clearly laid out as I would like it to be. And that probably made no sense to anybody what I just said there, but it made sense in my head, so that's good enough. It's probably going to stay in the video. And here we have all of our characters: Skeletor, Trapjaw, Evil Lyn, Merman and Triclops. Skeletor obviously has magical based stuff. He can teleport people around the board. He can actually use magical attacks while he is engaged with an enemy. Trapjaw has some cool abilities. He starts the game with a grappling hook attached, and he can use that to drag himself up the side of walls and across the battlefield. He can also swap out that grappling hook for a laser gun, so he can keep changing his functionality during the game based on his current needs. Evelyn, of course, has magical powers. She can actually share her mana tokens with other characters, and she has a Dark Presence ability, which gives her the opportunity to put a blind token on other characters. Merman can create puddles, making difficult terrain on the battlefield as he needs, and he also has a freeze ray, which will cripple a target. And then of course we have Triclops, who I have already wittered on about for long enough. Next up you get 2 decks of mini cards, and these are the armor, shields and trinkets, and both of these decks are exactly the same, but one is marked with the hero symbol, one is marked with the villain symbol, and it's just so that each player has a full deck of items to sift through. I will very quickly flick through this deck of cards just so you can see the artwork. It's fun to look at all of the things and see how they link back to the old cartoons, the old action figures, things like that. For example, right here we have the old battle damaged armor. We've got a battle harness, Gartech vest, a helm, a very familiar looking helm, a magic cloak, a weapon holster, and the artwork is cartoony. It is reminiscent of the old TV show or the old comic strips even. I think some of the art actually does a good job of resembling the accessories you got with the action figures themselves. It's quite fun to see this stuff. And there's loads of different options here. Lots of different things you can use to customize your team. And I'm sure there will be certain things, certain powerful combinations that will emerge. And here we have the 2 decks of weapons. That's magical weapons, ranged weapons, and melee weapons. And these are full-size cards. You have 1 deck for the heroes, 1 deck for the villains. They are almost identical except for any card that has this symbol in the top. This is a unique item representing a starting item for a character. For example, Cosmic Storm here is the starting item for Orko. So in this deck you have the starting items for the heroes, this deck you have the starting items for the villains, but everything else is the same across both decks. So you can actually equip your heroes pretty much the same as the villains if you want to. These weapon cards have a standard format. Up in the top corner here, it will tell you whether it's a magical weapon, a ranged weapon, or a melee weapon. You then have your piece of artwork. Over here you have any additional costs. It's always going to cost you action points to attack, but it might cost you additional action points or mana points as well. We have the range of the spell here, any modifiers to the dice roll, any special rules, and then down here we have the results. So this is what will happen based on the number of successes you roll. And we have all sorts of different stuff. Cursed minions, eternal rings, a flaming missile, a fireball, a magic blast, and some of this stuff looks like it could have been lifted from the old comics. Some of it looks just like recreations of the accessories for the action figures, which is pretty neat. The purple sword of power in particular looks very much like the sword that came with the Skeletor action figure. But there's lots of cool stuff in here. As I said before, the 2 decks are predominantly the same, so it is possible to have Terror Claws on He-Man, for example. That's not a specifically evil item. But there are certain items that are limited to certain characters. Any card that has a little symbol in the top right corner is exclusive to a particular character. But there's lots of good stuff here. I hope at some point there will be even more options available. Obviously any new characters they introduce will have their own unique items, but it would be nice to have other items come out as well, perhaps packs of cards that they could sell separately, just to expand your options. Regardless, there's plenty here to choose from to start with. Certainly more than enough options considering there is currently only 5 characters on each side to choose from. We are nearly done, just a few more decks of cards to get through. These are the Fate decks. There is one deck for each player. There are 48 cards in each of these decks, and you will not use all 48 in any game. The idea is you actually build a deck of 20 cards, and then you will shuffle that deck and draw from it as the game goes on. So there's a little deck building aspect here. They do have certain cards that are marked, if I can find one. There are certain cards that have your faction symbol like that there, and you have those marked. So for your first game, you just use the marked cards, so you don't have to worry about deck building right from the start. But once you've played a few games, you will probably want to create your own decks, mainly to tailor them towards which characters you like to take or particular strategies you want to employ. And these Fate cards are the heart of the initiative system, really, because both players will pick one Fate card from their hand. You will have a hand of 5 cards, and you will play them face down. You then flip them over, and you compare this number in the top corner. The person who has the highest card will go first. They then apply that card to one of their characters that hasn't activated in the current round. That gives you your base amount of action points and mana points for that character's activation this round. You then look at the bonus underneath. You can either use the bonus to gain 1 mana token, or there's a special rule that you can apply. In this case, you can gain 1 mana token for each wound on this particular character. So if you have a character who is very badly wounded, you apply this card to them and they will get loads of mana tokens for the round. That's really powerful. And then once you've done that, you can activate your character using those action points, using those mana tokens. But the interesting thing is, as your character activates, you can continue to play additional cards to them. You don't get any more action points or mana points from the top half of the card, but you can continue to apply the bonuses from the bottom part of the card. So you can keep loading up on mana points, you can keep loading up on special rules, special abilities, and it's possible to chain multiple cards together to devastating effect. It's a really interesting system. Adding an additional twist to this card system are the glory cards. Each player has 2 of these glory cards allocated at the start of the game. There are 9 per player. You shuffle them, you draw 3, you keep 2, and those are in your hand for the whole game. You never get any more. They are super powerful Fate cards, basically. They give you action points and mana points as normal, but also they have special objectives at the bottom of the card that score victory points. This one, for example, if you use a ranged weapon to knock out an enemy, you gain 20 victory points. Alternatively, you can use that bonus to gain an additional action, which can also be very powerful. But normally, you would want to be trying to score those victory points because it's a victory points game. You will win by having the most victory points at the end of the 4th turn. So these glory cards are extra objectives, extra ways to score additional points. And that's it for the contents of the box, but I think there's quite a lot in there. Although you only get 10 characters, you also get a lot of different scenery to create lots of different battlefields, and there's loads of different cards for customizing your team. And also with all those different Fate cards and that deck building element, there's lots of different strategies you can try out. So there really is a lot of different options just in the box alone. But really, I want extra characters. I'm really excited to see other characters coming out so that I can add them to my forces. And yes, I am absolutely going to be buying every character that comes out for this game. I really am a big fan of Masters of the Universe, and this is an opportunity for me to have a collection of Masters of the Universe miniatures. But for now, I don't think there's a lot more I can say. These are just my initial thoughts based on looking at the components, reading through the rules, looking at all of the cards, and trying to piece it all together in my head before my first game. But overall, I really am very excited about this game, and I can't wait to get the miniatures assembled. In fact, I'm going to put together a few of them right now to show you before we sign off this video. So all I've done is hop across to my workstation and assemble the 2 miniatures that I'm sure everybody wants to see the most. That is He-Man and Skeletor, and here we have He-Man, and this is a really nice miniature. The first thing I'm going to say is, when I was looking at these on the sprue, I suggested they looked a little bit small, and I suggested they were maybe 28mm. I would say, having had them assembled now, they are probably more likely to be closer to 32mm. I can compare them to some other miniatures I have here, just to show you the difference. First up, this is Gandalf from the Middle-earth battle game. He's a 25mm miniature, and you can see that He-Man stands much taller than that. And indeed, if we look at one of the classic D&D miniatures, this vampire here, Again, He-Man is a taller figure. He is actually comparable in size to Imelda Braskov from Warhammer Quest Cursed City. In fact, he is taller, but the proportions are different. He has a more realistic type of proportions. But that should give you some idea of the kind of scale you are looking at, and which miniature lines the Masters of the Universe miniatures will be compatible with. In terms of assembly, this miniature went together incredibly well. There were very few mold lines, just a little bit of cleanup, and the way it went together, all of the joints are pretty much seamless. I don't know if any of them are going to show up at all. There is, on his chest plate, there was a very small fiddly chest plate that had to be fitted in there. That was the most difficult bit to deal with, and really the only bit where you can see some join lines. The arms were separate and you can't really see the joins there. The legs were separate, the shield was separate. It really was quite a lot of different components to put together. Even the torso was in two pieces, front and back. But it really has gone together quite seamlessly. It was very well tooled indeed. I don't really think it needed to be in as many parts as it was, and as I said, the chest plate in particular was quite fiddly to deal with, but it wasn't the hardest miniature in the world to put together, and the results I think are excellent. It's a really, really nice miniature, exactly what I would want from a He-Man miniature actually. And then we have everybody's favourite bad boy, Skeletor. Skeletor was in even more pieces than He-Man, and he was even more fiddly to deal with. I did not enjoy putting this miniature together at all. There were things like the little epaulette things, the pauldrons on his shoulder. Those were separate elements that had to be glued in place. But in particular, the arm that is holding the Havoc staff, that had to be positioned in just such a way that the pauldron would sit on the top of it, and you had to line it up perfectly, and there was just a little bit too much wiggle room, a little bit too much give in where the arm connected to the torso, so it was very difficult to line up, and I think it is just a little bit gappy, and it's the first bit of either of these miniatures where there was something that didn't quite fit like I would have liked it to. Also, when I plugged Skeletor into the base, I feel like this leg here twisted ever so slightly out of alignment, making it look like it's bulging slightly away from his hip, and there's not really anything I can do about that now because the glue is set. I don't think it will show when it's all painted up, but looking at it closely and being nitpicky, I'm not 100% happy with the alignment of that leg. But again, it is a nice pose, it's a really nice miniature. I am very happy with it overall, just a few little nitpicks, and just, again, a few too many pieces to make it a fun thing to put together. I would have much rather had less elements to deal with. But overall, nice miniatures. So there we have just a quick look at two of the miniatures. I would say the results are excellent. I'm really happy with the look of the finished miniatures, but they were a little bit annoying to put together at times. They weren't the hardest miniatures I've ever put together. I still think Kingdom Death Monster miniatures are probably still the most fiddly ones I've ever had to deal with. Either that or the Elder Scrolls Call to Arms ones maybe. But these are certainly not really easy to put together. They do have keyed elements, so there are pegs and recesses where they line up to help you fit them together correctly, but they are not push fit like some of the Games Workshop starter sets are. And they will require a little bit of patience. They are perhaps not the perfect miniatures for a first timer, but as long as you take your time, as long as you take care, follow the instructions in the instruction manual very carefully, those instructions are incredibly good, and you shouldn't go too far wrong. Of course, I say that in confidence, still having 8 more to put together, which may be an absolute pain to deal with. In fact, I'm going to go and deal with those right now, because that's it from me for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so, and hopefully I will see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.